Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the Doorstep podcast. I'm your co-host, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Council, Gvosdev.
And I'm Tatiana Serafin, also Senior Fellow at Carnegie Council, with a very special episode of the Doorstep today on Ukraine, what is happening after a week after Russian tanks rolled in, with special guest Melinda Haring, the Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, who is just back from Warsaw, who's been talking to people on the ground in Europe and now back in Washington, D.C., who's going to share with us some very important information and updates. I'm very excited to hear what Melinda is thinking and doing these days, Nick. Also, especially after Biden's State of the Union, which happened to be a little light on I guess, in encouraging us Americans to think about Ukraine in our day-to-day. What do you think?
I thought that the speech was very interesting it started with this real almost callback to the great days of the Cold War, the United States putting together a global coalition in defense of peace and freedom throughout the world, and that Ukraine is on the front lines of the struggle between freedom and autocracy, and that the Ukraine struggle is really everyone's struggle. The rhetoric was there, but then we started to hear a little less about some of the concrete details of what the United States is prepared to do. We heard what the United States is not prepared to do, which can make sense. We have to be prudential. We're dealing with a state which has nuclear weapons, but on the other hand, it was a stirring call to action with some pieces missing. Also very interesting in that a number of the themes that we were hearing from the administration over the last year. We heard a lot about allies with regard to standing up against Russia. We didn't hear a lot about allies working together on technological cooperation or on how we're going to tackle climate change or how we're going to tackle the fuel crisis, the energy crisis that is upon us. We heard a lot about U.S. manufacturing, and in some ways a sense that continuity with the Trump administration of a bit of America first, at least when it comes to the economy, which kind of clashes with this invocation of allied partnerships in a common struggle. So interesting for what we heard and didn't hear in the speech. I think that for those that were looking for more clarity about what the United States is prepared to do beyond certainly the very devastating sanctions which have been imposed on Russia, which will have a cost on Russia's power, but whether or not that will affect Putin's calculus in Ukraine remains to be seen. I still think that in some ways we got the beginnings, but really didn't get a fully satisfying answer.
Yeah, and I think a lot of, in my feed, at least, in all my social feeds, there are more questions. There's definitely more support for doing more in Ukraine across the board, across the political spectrum that I'm seeing. I personally didn't see it reflected in Biden's speech. At least some of the chatter that I'm seeing online, people are doing way more specific outreach, way more specific humanitarian efforts. And these are the things that I think will make a difference. And they're also surprisingly very upset that the US isn't doing more militarily. And I know that's a line that the US doesn't want to cross in Ukraine, and NATO doesn't want to cross because of the threat of nuclear weapons with Russia. But I am hearing on the ground, Nick, that people want more military action. And so we'll hear more about that and other things from Melinda right now. Thanks so much again, Melinda, for joining us. I want to start off by saying we are 1 week away, or in, I should say, from a world war. Some people are calling it World War III. And I wanted to recap, to start off our conversation, to say, where are we? Online, people sometimes don't look at when things are posted. When articles are posted, they might be reading incorrect information, old information. But where are we March 2nd, 1 week after tanks started rolling into Ukraine? Can you tell us, what you see after 1 week?
Thanks, guys, for the chance to be here. It's a real pleasure. I haven't seen Nick in 7 years, so we got to do this more often. So, okay, there's a couple of headlines that stick out. So we've been at this for a week. There haven't been that many casualties. One casualty is too many, of course, but there haven't really been that many casualties. That's one of the things that I think is quite surprising. I think the Russians' tactics are also quite surprising. It looks like the Russians are playing with their B team, maybe their C team, and we can talk about that in a little bit more depth. But just let me give you the headlines. We have 2 million refugees, and the number is increasing, and it's likely to go as high as 7 million. And the times and the waits are very, very long. They're about 2 days on the border. And there's some reports that there's not good sanitation in some of these places, which I think is really alarming. I'm really, really worried that Vladimir Putin is really angry and is likely to engage in Grozny-style tactics next. Those are the tactics he used in Chechnya in the 2000s. And that means indiscriminate bombing in big cities, especially in Kiev and Kharkiv, which is the second largest city in the north. What that means is that if you are in Ukraine right now, you need to get out and go to the European Union as soon as possible or seek refuge in the mountains. The situation is going to get much worse. And unfortunately, there's not a whole lot the West can do.
Yeah, can I touch on that? Because, we just had the President's State of the Union. On the one hand, a very rousing rhetorical defense of freedom, of Ukraine as a victim of aggression. We stand with Ukraine. Ukraine is part of the democratic community. And then the president also established a series of, and these are things we will not do, including sending troops. Do you have a sense of, what you said, not much that the West can do? Sanctions have been imposed. Do you have a sense that there's much enthusiasm? One of the things you do with the Atlantic Council is, you're one of the people meeting in capitals all throughout the Western world. You encounter parliamentarians and members of Congress and people from the executive branches. Is there a sense that there's a limit as to how much support they are prepared to give Ukraine? And we've already heard that American troops on the ground, that's off the table. But other ideas have been proposed: no-fly zones, shipments of more advanced weapons. What's your sense of, how far Western governments, the U.S., other European and NATO allies are willing to go?
Nick, I think I should say there's real limits. And what I mean by that is the West is not going to be able to stop Vladimir Putin. Biden has said very clearly that we're not putting US boots on the ground, but there are some options short of that. We have some military fellows here at the Atlantic Council, and they've reminded me that there are military options that President Biden has not ruled out if we are creative and wise. So, if the situation continues to escalate in the kind of scenario that I was talking about, and I hope that it doesn't, but please don't understand me. I'm not a cheerleader for war, but this is the direction I see it going in. If it does escalate, President Biden could use the U.S. Air Force, and he could use ships that are not that far away to fire back, to prevent the loss of massive amounts of life. I don't think we're there yet. I don't think the Biden administration is willing to consider ideas like that. Those ideas are too radical right now. I mean, good that they're going to resupply with weapons. That's wonderful. It's not enough, though. And this administration is not open to arguments for a no-fly zone. And we just saw that the Europeans wimped out. They said that they were going to send jets, and then they wimped out. And, everyone's afraid of Vladimir Putin. And the real discussion is, what the hell is up with Vladimir Putin? Nick, you've been studying him as long as I have. And this is not Vladimir Putin that we've been studying since the end of 1999. He's changed. He is a risk taker, but he's a cautious risk taker. He was in the intelligence services for many years. He's not a sexy spy. He's a loser. They put him in Dresden. You have to remember, don't make Vladimir Putin, into James Bond. He's not at all. But he is isolated and paranoid, and he was paranoid before COVID, and he's even more paranoid. So one of the most interesting things that I've sort of fixated on is his discussion with Emmanuel Macron. And so when he met with Emmanuel Macron, not only did he require Macron to have 3 PCR tests, and they sat, at the ends of this enormous table, and everyone's been making fun of it, but Putin wouldn't stop talking about Russia's historic grievances. And Macron would say, How about we talk about a ceasefire agreement or a peace agreement? And it was back to, what has the West done to me? What has NATO done to me? Maybe the West is just really naive. Putin has been making these demands and saying these kinds of things since the Munich speech. This is a long time, and maybe we just didn't want to believe it. There's an argument that Putin has been planning this for a long time and waiting for his moment. And there's a lot of reasons why this is the right moment now for him to strike. He's not going to get a more advantageous moment when the West is completely weak, and he can get away with it. And he also sees the writing on the wall. If he doesn't strike now, Ukraine is moving in a westward direction. 62% of Ukrainians want to join NATO. So I think part of his calculation is that he wants to end the westernizing drive in Ukraine on his own timetable.
Is it just the West problem, though? And I know I've been reading reports from Asia that, there's mixed messaging. Japan is helping, Australia on board, at least with refugees. But, if he sees a weak West, what is happening in Asia? Is the support of China also bolstering him to even make these nuclear threat demands more?
Look, China's a problem, and Vladimir Putin and Xi have a complicated relationship. They have this very long bromance. We have these enduring conversations in Washington about how hot and heavy it is. And there's a new paper by Dr. Harley Balzer that we just published at the Atlantic Council, and I think it's an excellent paper. And he says, yes, on the presidential level, there are very strong ties, but go deeper, go deeper, go deeper. And those links are not as deep as one might expect. And he thinks it's much ado about nothing. So yes, they take photo ops, they give each other necklaces, they drink vodka together. But these countries want fundamentally different things. And when it gets really serious, their interests are much different. So I would like to believe that argument very much. Japan has really stepped up with sanctions. And I think that they're going to do more. I think people are motivated by the images coming out of Ukraine and the human suffering. Yeah. But is it the West's responsibility? Yeah, it's our real estate, right? Putin wants to reshape the European security architecture. That's what he's doing here. He's trying to destroy NATO or break the unity of NATO, depends on how you want to put it. He wants to humiliate the West, and he wants to be the boss in Europe. So yeah, it is our problem.
Melinda, you were in Kiev right before the invasion, or the re-invasion, or the continuing invasion. You were able to meet with parliamentarians, with people in the government, actors in civil society. What was your sense of their? People are saying now, well, what does a possible settlement look like? I mean, what's your sense of what Ukrainian society and the political establishment are prepared or not prepared to offer to get an end to the fighting? Or is it a sense that this really is an existential struggle, and that Ukraine can't give in on some of the demands not only that Russia was making, but that prior to Putin's invasion, some Europeans seemed open to, with regard to a pause on NATO, or federalizing Ukraine, or whatever whatever the Minsk settlements that they were thinking about doing. What was your sense of the mood in Kiev?
Nick, they're both no-goes. So you're right that behind the scenes, before Russia invaded Ukraine again last Thursday, there were attempts from Western governments to press Kiev to capitulate on NATO, to freeze it for a certain period of time. They got a hell no. And then there was pressure to implement the Minsk agreements. And I think it's worth just reminding your viewers. So the Minsk agreements are two agreements that were passed when Ukraine was very, very weak in 2014 and 2015. And these are agreements that were signed by the French, the Germans, the Ukrainians, and the Russians. And the Ukrainians will not implement them because they are disadvantageous to Ukraine, and they will tear the country apart. So when there was private pressure to implement Minsk, again, the answer was no. I don't think there's any room for negotiation on either of these items, especially after last Thursday,
Yeah.
right?
Well,
Why should Kiev give in? There's no reason. Why should they take Moscow at its word? Putin said he wasn't going to invade. He's not a credible negotiator. Would you take him seriously? I certainly wouldn't. He sent his former culture minister to negotiate. What kind of joke is that?
Yeah, not exactly the seriousness that you would convey that you're sending your top diplomats.
Yeah, I mean, send Lavrov if you're serious.
And I think to that point, who they're sending, let's go back to that question, because I was really, really curious about you talking about B team, C team. We know that, unlike 2014, when they sent in mercenaries, they have sent in their regular army, but talk to us about this B team, C team idea, and why this might be why we're hearing about logistics problems, potential desertions, and this sort of thing.
Yeah, so the headline here is that Vladimir Putin thinks he understands Ukraine better than he actually does. So the Russians made all kinds of stupid calculations. When you go to war, it's not just about tanks, right? It's not just about men on the ground, men and women on the ground. It's not about all the cool military gear. There's a lot of assumptions that go into war, and their assumptions were wrong. So the Kremlin said, this is going to be a piece of cake. We're going to roll in, we're going to get rid of Zelensky, and we're going to install a pro-Russian leader. In Kiev, the rumor was that it would be Viktor Medvedchuk. I don't know if that's true or not. There's rumors now that the Russians want to install Yanukovych, the former thug that Ukrainians threw out in 2013, 2014, to which Ukraine will say, we will fight till the end, the end of our lives. There's just no way that he will ever be accepted. The broader point is the Kremlin doesn't understand Ukraine. Ukraine has fundamentally changed since 2014, when there was the Euromaidan revolution. Ukrainians firmly rejected the Moscow sphere of influence. They want to be part of Europe. I'm not going to recapitulate that whole series, but violence was used against students. Their parents came to the square. It was a long, drawn out process that lasted 3 months, very cold, and it ended in violence. Eventually, Yanukovych fled to Moscow. New elections were held. And since then, Ukraine has been pushing through a lot of reforms. Are they perfect? No. And I'm very critical of them. Before last Thursday, I was one of Zelensky's fiercest critics. He sucks on domestic reform. He is terrible on anti-corruption reform and judicial reform, but he's a damn good commander-in-chief. And he's impressed, I think, the world and the nation with his physical courage, with his unflinching his stiff lip. And he knows that he's a sitting target and he's not moving. So, but let's go back to the B team. So the assumption was that Ukrainians wouldn't fight. So if the Russians had read a newspaper, they would know that that's false, because the Razumkov Center, one of the best public opinion polling centers in Kiev, found that 45% of Ukrainians would stay and fight. And we're seeing that there is a fierce resistance. Are they going to be able to fight the Russian military? They don't have the same kind of equipment. They have AK-47s, right? So yes, it's not perfect. And when you look at just sort of, you compare Russian forces versus Ukrainian forces, the Ukrainians can't compete, right? The Ukrainian Air Force is tiny, the Navy is minuscule, but you have to remember, Ukrainians have been fighting for 8 years. This is their home turf. They're much, much more motivated. So yes, it's never going to be a fair shot, but they've got a chance. They've really got a chance because of these different circumstances. The question really is, how long can they hold out? And we know that Moscow is trying to take Kiev. That's the big goal, and to get rid of Zelensky. And we know that the West is not going to put troops on the ground, and they're not going to implement a no-fly zone. So this really comes down to the courage of individual people and of individual Ukrainians, ordinary Ukrainians, doctors, lawyers, accountants, people who are on the streets and who are fighting for their country.
I think your point you made about sort of Zelensky's image, and really, I think more than anything else, for many ordinary Americans who don't otherwise really follow the news, people have been captivated by the image of a young president, very clearly courageous, telegenic, obviously, because of his previous career in the entertainment industry. And I think that has been part of this groundswell of support that you've seen in the United States towards really seeing taking an interest in Ukraine. Certainly you see that on social media. But I have a very cynical colleague who then looks at all of this and says, this is all superficial. Domestic U.S. support is superficial, that he pointed to the very careful exempting of oil and gas from some of the sanctions, sales of oil and gas, OPEC Plus today meeting indicating they're not going to make any major increases. And so the sense that does the Biden administration get constrained over time with what it can do if it is going to be facing, as you noted earlier, supplies of energy to world markets, food prices going up. Is there a point, do you think, and being based in Washington, when you talk to members of Congress, you talk to their staffs, do you have a sense that their constituents are in for the long haul, or that this is going to be, it's a popular issue today, but in a few weeks or a few months, the level of domestic U.S. support for Ukraine may drop off? What are you hearing in D.C. On those, and also from people in the administration as they're looking at what's going to be a pretty tough midterm season?
Nick, I think I'm even more cynical than your friend. I see a lot of this in the limitations of U.S. options through that political lens. This is a midterm year where, we're not very far away from those elections. And Biden has a foreign policy problem, right? After Afghanistan, he is going to be raked over the coals by the Republicans if he loses Ukraine. So in that sense, they've got to get this right. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why Biden knows that he has to get this right. Yeah. But politically, he's going to have a really hard time. COVID hasn't magically disappeared. The economy hasn't picked up to the extent that he wanted, and now he has this giant, he has World War III on his hands, or the possibility of World War III on his hands. So that's I think that's one of the reasons why there's so much pressure to get this right. I also think, though, that Biden really cares about this crisis. When he was the vice president, he was in charge of Ukraine and Ukraine's reforms. He knows the brief. He cares about the brief. This is personal to him. And then if you look at his long history in public service, foreign policy is his jam, and he cares about freedom and democracy in the world. So I think for those three reasons, that's why this is personal. And I think the White House, does care, and they're involved. Now, Congress, they're in, they're all in, and their support has not wavered at all. There's an extremely strong caucus on Capitol Hill. They're amazing. The constituents are very vocal. I have no worries about Congress getting squishy at all.
But your cynicism then comes with the general American public, however, yes?
No, the American public is awesome. 70% of Americans really care about this. And I think it's simple. Do they want boots on the ground? No. People are still upset about Iraq and Afghanistan. And there was no reckoning, for all these public intellectuals in Washington making the case for war. I'm very proud of the fact that I did not support the Iraq war. I'm a registered Republican. I thought it was stupid, but there's never been a reckoning for these public intellectuals and people who made the case for war. These people should not be in think tanks, and they should not be making arguments. But that's a side issue. The American public cares about this issue for a simple reason. We fought the king. We didn't want to be a supplicants, and the Ukrainian people don't want to be supplicants to the Russian Tsar. It's that easy. And that's why this message really resonates with the American people.
I want to, if we can switch to a journalism question here. What is your thought on coverage? What are you reading? So where can our audience and where can we share good information? There's a lot of disinformation and propaganda going on. I think Putin tried to shape the narrative before he went in, and he was unable to. People very aggressively fought it, Biden included, by publicly sharing information. But there is, as we talk about, the fog of war. There are on TikTok, videos. Maybe they're true, maybe they're not. Where are you getting your information? A, and B, how do you grade, the coverage of this war so far?
Okay, so it depends on, your language abilities, but if you want good information in English, I think CNN is doing a hell of a job. They have correspondents all over the country. You probably will never have me on this podcast again, but I don't have a TV in my house. I'll admit it, but you know, I decided to change my old-fashioned ways and get a TV during this crisis. And I love their coverage in Kiev, in Lviv. I think it's just first rate. And they're bringing in really good experts, and some of the presenters are really empathetic, and they understand, you know, the stakes here. I think NPR is doing a pretty good job, and the Washington Post, New York Times are doing phenomenal work. I think that Kiev Post and Kiev Independent, both smaller papers in Ukraine, are reliable, and I trust their coverage. If you know Russian or Ukrainian, Novo Vremya, the liberal magazine in Kiev, is phenomenal. If you and then there's publications, you know, in Moscow that show what's going on there. So, you know, Echo Moskvy just got shut down, but they were totally reliable. And then New Times in Russia is also fantastic as well. So those are the places that I go. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty is amazing. They have first-rate coverage. And then there's just individual reporters that I always follow what they're saying and doing. Christopher Miller with BuzzFeed is my favorite reporter in Ukraine. He knows the beat better than anyone else. He's reliable. He's fearless. And you know, he's fabulous. The defense reporter for the Kiev Independent is also very good on Twitter, and he's all over the place. I have colleagues on the ground, Michael Basikaru, that I would encourage you to follow him. He's in Lviv. Terrell Germain Starr is on the ground, and then Vladislav Davidazin is on the ground. So the Atlantic Council has 3 people on the ground, and these are not accredited journalists. These are people who've decided to take a risk and tell the story to their great honor and courage.
What about the story or how Putin's trying to control the narrative in Russia? Because I think, you know, part of what we talked about a lot is that in order for something to shift in Russia is that the population will have to you know, like Navalny tweeted, you know, they have to rise up. And how will they rise up? Well, 2 ways. You know, if they feel that the casualties in Ukraine are exceeding any sort of, you know, narrative of where we should be in there, or if body bags start coming home. And I think that Russia's trying to temper both of those, both coverage of those in Russia. And the fact also that Russians receive information, right? Traditionally, socialist country, you receive information. You're not really so much going out to seek information. And now the people that do seek information are blocked on Twitter. They're blocked on Facebook. So, you know, how can the narrative in Russia shift? How can we get information? And that's what kind of I worry about on the information side. So there's a military way that we can try to shape things, or a fundraising way, but then this information war is where I worry. And what are some of your thoughts there?
I think that's one of the most crucial questions. So I thank God for cat videos because they're keeping YouTube free. I had a conversation with Milov recently, and he said if it weren't for cat videos, the Kremlin would have disabled YouTube. And he said, I had to use YouTube the other day to unlock my apartment door because I locked myself out. And he said, ordinary Russians are keeping YouTube free. And that's where the opposition puts its videos and is able to communicate with ordinary people. Now, there's big worries in Moscow that that's going to be throttled. So that's something to keep your eye on. But honestly, Professor, the US government and Western donors need to put a huge amount of money behind a Russian language television station. There's a huge need for it right now. But there's a couple of caveats. So TV in Russia and Ukraine is more expensive than it is in the United States. So it's very hard to compete. The production values on Russian and Ukrainian TV are much higher than US TV. So you might have 3 cameras and they're coming at you with different angles. And it's just more interesting. It's visually more interesting, but it's more expensive. And the reason why is that it's funded by oligarchs. So the oligarchs have endless money to dump on TV. You know, are we going to be able to compete with multiple angles? Probably not. But can we produce a damn good product? Definitely. So it's time for Congress to pony up and to get serious about this. And this is not a 3-year commitment. This is a 20-year commitment, maybe a 30-year commitment. And there's some good ideas in Washington already on how to do this.
Yeah, just as you're mentioning that, again, and it's spilled milk, and the point that you've made too about that these are long-term investments is, you know, a while back, there was talk and proposals that, you know, based in key Russian language centers outside of Russia that are still part of kind of the Russian cultural space to do this. And of course, you know, no one wanted to pony up the funds because it was expensive and the like, but it does point to the fact that with all of these things that when crises happen, capabilities just don't spring up overnight. You have to have prepared for them. You've had to have resourced them, and whether that's military capabilities or, as we're seeing increasingly, I think what we're learning from this the invasion is how much the informational aspect of conflict is rising in importance.
Absolutely. And Nick, if you don't mind, I'm going to two finger and say it's vital that we keep research centers open for people to study Russian and Ukrainian. 10 years ago, when I was at Georgetown as a grad student, I had to beg to go study Russian. And my stipend didn't even cover my groceries for the summer. And it didn't cover the textbooks. It was the smallest, most miserly stipend I've ever received for a summer program. I mean, we got through it. I didn't eat very much that summer. But it's really, really hard to be a Russia-Ukraine specialist. There are just so few jobs. And if you're talented, my friends all think I'm crazy. They're like, why didn't you go to law school to make real money? When you love something, you do it, and you find a way to stay in a job that's not necessarily super advantageous. There's very, very few chairs to be an expert on Russia and Ukraine because we haven't put the money in this. And it takes a long time to build expertise. This is not something you can turn on overnight. We have good expertise in the US government, but our expertise in the think tank communities and analytical community could be much, much stronger if we'd made that investment 10 or 20 years ago.
And I think that trickles down, and it's something I've been really looking at. These schools, elementary schools, middle schools, high schools are putting together one-pagers on understanding the Russia-Ukraine war, and is it a one-pager, and how do you become an expert, when you don't speak to the language or when you're not studying it? And I think that really concerns me on how the general public is going to understand the crisis, because I think there's a disconnect between information, fact-checkable information, and a TikTok meme.
Absolutely. But I wouldn't belittle the TikTok memes. So there's a lady who did a TikTok video, and I've been on TV constantly in the last week, and she got far more videos with one silly TikTok video, and her information was completely accurate. And she was able to talk to a crowd that I will never have access to. So God bless her. Keep doing the TikTok videos. But the analytic community also is prissy and entitled and doesn't speak a language that Americans understand. You have to get away from the sort of Washington speak of Russia wants to rewrite the rules of the European security architecture. What does that mean? It means that Russia wants to be the boss of Europe. And you have to be able to explain to Americans why this matters and why they should open their wallets now. The think tank community needs to put away its Ivy League degrees and start talking in normal English to people about why this crisis matters, because Americans are generous and they will understand why this matters immediately.
It just reminds me, we've had your colleague Ash Jain talking about this very issue. How do you connect foreign policy to the doorstep, and precisely this point about language, and also the highfalutin terminology, but to say to Americans, this matters to you because it impacts your security, it impacts your pocketbook, it impacts the type of world that you live in and that you want for your children. Exactly. That's the type of thing. And again, it's been, coming back to the State of the Union, the president, I think, talked the stirring rhetorical language of defense of peace and freedom throughout the world. But I don't know that at the end of that section, the opening section on Ukraine, he really made that doorstep case to Americans as strongly as he might have, which is surprising given the people around him, starting with the National Security Advisor, who've always had this thing about, we have to make foreign policy relevant and connected to the interests of the American middle class and working families. But I think it's exactly as you said, and why we appreciate that you're coming on to a podcast appropriately named The Doorstep, to try to get that message out to the extent that even we can try to reach out to the generations that don't necessarily watch McNeil, well, not McNeil Lara, the news hour anymore,
Dated yourself.
but we'll watch TikTok. Yeah.
Nick, I think it's even more surprising though for the everyday president. Joe Biden is, an average guy. He didn't go to the Ivy League and he uses ordinary language and he's sort of an aw shucks kind of guy. So the fact that they missed that is, I think, a pretty gross oversight. So if you need to boil it down, why does this conflict matter? So this conflict matters. I have a 7-year-old daughter, and I don't want her to live in a world where might makes right. And if Vladimir Putin rolls in and takes over Ukraine, what do you think the world's going to look like? It's going to be a mean, nasty place. The descriptions of Hobbes are going to be our world. And the Chinese can't wait to stir stuff up in the South China Sea and take Taiwan. So that's one reason. Number two, I'd like to avoid World War III, and I think everyone else would. If the crisis gets out of hand, Vladimir Putin is really unstable right now. No one can predict his behavior. He's threatening nuclear weapons. Will he attack Washington, D.C. or Omaha, Nebraska? Probably not. But I'd say there's a 50-50 shot he pulls out a tactical nuke in Ukraine. I hope that's wrong. I hope that I'm being paranoid. But it's very scary, and we need to be prepared. And then I think the third reason is we have an obligation as humans to help refugees and people who are suffering, innocent victims who've done nothing wrong. And there's going to be millions of refugees right now. And if we can help them as humans, we have to do it.
I think that's a great place to end our podcast. We very much appreciate your time and hope to have you back when this is all over.
Oh my God. It's going to be a while, I hate to say, but I'd love to come back, and thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for what you're both doing.
Well, thank you for coming on.
Thanks for listening to The Doorstep, sponsored by the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. For more, go to carnegiecouncil.org. Stay healthy and safe.